The thunder crashed like a gunshot across the darkening Montana sky as Violet Turner clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Palisade, a dusty speck on the western frontier, had appeared like a mirage on the horizon just as her strength was failing. The year was 1876, and what had begun as a journey to a new teaching position had transformed into a desperate fight for survival when the stagecoach overturned, killing the driver and leaving her the sole survivor in a vast, unforgiving wilderness. The rain began to fall in earnest now, the warm June air suddenly chilled by the approaching storm. Lightning illuminated the main street of Palisade, revealing a row of wooden buildings, their paint peeling under the harsh western sun. A saloon door swung open, spilling light onto the muddy street, and a tall figure emerged, silhouetted against the golden glow. "Miss, you need to get inside." The man's voice carried over the wind as he crossed the distance between them with long strides. Violet could barely make out his features, just the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat and broad shoulders beneath a long duster coat. "This storm's turning bad. Where's your escort?" "Dead," she managed, her voice breaking. "The stagecoach. There was an accident about 10 miles back." The stranger's expression changed immediately. Without hesitation, he took her arm and guided her toward a modest building with a hand-painted sign that read Sheriff's Office. "Xavier Harrington," he introduced himself as they stepped inside the shelter of the small wooden structure. "Most folks around here call me Zav. I'm the sheriff of Palisade." In the lamplight, Violet could finally see him clearly. Sheriff Harrington was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of the sky before a storm. A star-shaped badge gleamed on his chest, and though his manner was gentle, she noted the well-worn holster at his hip. "Violet Turner," she replied, water dripping from her sodden traveling dress onto the wooden floor. "I was to be the new school teacher." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Was to be." "The position was in Fort Benton. I don't suppose there's any chance of reaching it now." Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her as the reality of her situation settled in. "Not tonight, that's for certain," Xavier replied, moving to stoke the small iron stove in the corner of his office. "And Fort Benton's still a good 3 days' ride from here." Violet sank into a chair, her legs finally giving way. "I've lost everything. My luggage, my teaching materials, the letter of introduction." Xavier pulled off his duster, revealing a blue cotton shirt stretched across broad shoulders. He hung the coat on a peg and turned to face her. "Miss Turner, Palisade has been without a teacher for nearly 8 months now. Our last one left to get married back east. The children here need schooling just as much as those in Fort Benton." Violet looked up, her green eyes wide with surprise. "Are you offering me a position?" "I'm offering you a chance," he corrected with a slight smile. "The town council would need to approve it officially, but as luck would have it, they're meeting tomorrow. In the meantime, Mrs. Landry at the boarding house has a spare room. She'll get you settled for the night." The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows like angry fingers demanding entry. "That storm came from nowhere," Violet whispered. "Just like everything else today." Xavier nodded, his eyes thoughtful as he studied her face. "Sometimes life's like that out here. The West doesn't ask permission before it changes your plans." After escorting her to Mrs. Landry's boarding house, Xavier returned to his office, troubled by the image of Violet Turner's exhausted but determined face. Something about her called to him, perhaps the courage it must have taken to travel alone to the frontier, or the dignified way she'd handled what must have been a terrifying ordeal. The following day dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. Xavier woke early, as was his habit, and made his rounds through the awakening town. Palisade had grown considerably in the 5 years since he'd pinned on the sheriff's badge. What had once been little more than a trading post now boasted a general store, a saloon, a small church, and even a telegraph office, though the line to the next town was frequently down. He found himself walking past the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building that had stood empty since Miss Winters had departed in October. Through the window, he could see the rows of desks gathering dust, waiting for the voices of children to bring them back to life. The town council meeting was scheduled for noon, and as promised, Xavier presented Violet's case. She stood before the 5 council members, the mayor, The banker, the general store owner, the saloon proprietor, and the town doctor with her head held high despite her borrowed dress and the lingering shadows under her eyes. "Miss Turner comes highly recommended," Xavier found himself saying, though he had no written proof of her qualifications. "She's traveled all the way from Boston to teach." "And what of her references?" asked Mayor Stanton, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and suspicious eyes. "Lost in the stagecoach accident along with all her possessions," Xavier replied smoothly. "I graduated from the Boston Teachers College with honors," Violet added, her voice steady. "I can demonstrate my knowledge in any subject you wish to examine, Doctor." Peterson, a kindly older man with silver hair, smiled encouragingly. "I don't think that will be necessary, my dear. We've 28 children in Palisade who haven't had proper schooling in months. If Sheriff Harrington vouches for you, that's good enough for me." The vote was unanimous. Violet Turner would begin teaching the following Monday, with a month's trial period to prove herself. The salary was modest, but included room and board at Mrs. Landry's establishment. As they left the town hall, Xavier noticed color had returned to Violet's cheeks, along with a spark of determination in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply as they walked down the wooden sidewalk. "You didn't have to help a stranger." "Out here, strangers are just friends we haven't gotten to know yet," he replied with a smile. "Besides, those children need someone who cares enough to brave the wilds to teach them." They paused in front of the general store, where a notice board displayed wanted posters and community announcements. Xavier pointed to a faded paper announcing a town social scheduled for Saturday night. "Might be a good chance for you to meet the families of your future students," he suggested. "These things can be a bit rowdy, but folks are friendly enough." Violet studied the announcement with interest. "Will you be attending, Sheriff?" "I'll be there," he nodded. "Someone's got to make sure the Hawkins boys don't spike the punch again." She laughed then, the sound bright and unexpected, and Xavier felt something shift inside his chest. The next few days passed in a blur for Violet. Mrs. Landry, a widow in her 50s with a no-nonsense attitude and a surprising talent for dressmaking, helped her prepare for her new role. The town rallied around her, bringing donations of books, chalk, and even a new slate board for the schoolhouse. By Friday, the building had been cleaned, aired out, and made ready for Monday's lessons. Xavier kept his distance, occupied with his duties, but Violet often caught sight of him making his rounds through town. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness that contrasted with the upheaval of her life. Saturday evening arrived with the promise of social connection. Mrs. Landry had worked miracles with needle and thread, altering an old dress of her daughter's into something suitable for Violet. The pale blue cotton complemented her auburn hair, which she wore in a simple upswept style with a few tendrils framing her face. "You look lovely, dear Mrs. Landry approved. "You'll have every eligible bachelor in Palisade falling at your feet." Violet blushed. "I'm here to teach, not to find a husband," Mrs. Landry chuckled. "That's what my daughter said when she came west. Now she has 4 children and a ranch near Helena." She patted Violet's arm. "Just keep an open mind. The West changes people." The town hall had been transformed for the social. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor cleared for dancing. A small band of local musicians played lively tunes while townspeople of all ages mingled and laughed. Tables along one wall held an impressive array of food: fried chicken, ham, potato salad, cornbread, and pies of every description. Violet entered nervously, but was immediately welcomed by Dr. Peterson and his wife, who introduced her to a succession of parents and their curious children. Names and faces blurred together, but she did her best to remember each one, knowing they would soon be her responsibility. "Miss Turner." She turned to find Xavier Harrington standing behind her, looking decidedly different out of his sheriff's attire. He wore a clean white shirt with a black vest and tie, his usually tousled dark hair combed neatly. Without his hat, she noticed a small scar near his temple that disappeared into his hairline. "Sheriff Harrington," she greeted him with a smile. "This is quite the gathering." "Folks don't need much excuse to celebrate out here," he replied. "May I get you some punch? I've already checked that the Hawkins boys are behaving themselves tonight." The evening progressed pleasantly. Violet danced with several partners, including Mayor Stanton, Dr. Peterson, and even young Tommy Wheeler, who couldn't have been more than 12 but insisted on practicing his dancing skills. Through it all, she was aware of Xavier's presence, the way his eyes followed her around the room, the slight nod he gave when their gazes met across the crowded floor. Finally, as the band struck up a waltz, he approached her again. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Turner?" He extended his hand. His touch was warm and confident as he led her onto the dance floor. For a man who spent his days on horseback and keeping the peace, he moved with surprising grace. "I never thanked you properly for saving me from the storm," Violet said as they circled the floor. "I'd say you're doing Palisade a bigger favor by staying," he replied. "These children need someone like you." "Someone like me," she echoed. Xavier's blue eyes held her steadily. "Someone brave enough to start over when everything falls apart." The music ended too soon and they stepped apart. A strange tension hung between them, something unspoken but nonetheless real. "Miss Turner." A woman in a green dress approached, dragging a reluctant teenage boy by the arm. "This is my son, Peter. He's 15 and brilliant with numbers but refuses to return to school because the last teacher said he was disruptive." Violet turned her attention to her future student, but not before noticing the slight smile on Xavier's face as he moved away to speak with the mayor. Monday morning arrived with the ring of the school bell, a sound that hadn't been heard in Palisade for months. 26 children of varying ages filed into the schoolhouse, eyeing their new teacher with a mixture of curiosity, hope, and in some cases, well-disguised rebellion. Violet stood at the front of the room in her best dress, hands clasped to hide their slight trembling. "Good morning, children. I am Miss Turner, and I'm very pleased to meet each one of you." By the end of that first day, Violet was exhausted but exhilarated. The children's abilities varied widely. Some could barely write their names, while others, like Peter, showed remarkable aptitude in certain subjects. She would need to develop a flexible teaching plan to accommodate them all. As she gathered her materials at day's end, a knock at the schoolhouse door made her look up. Xavier stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Just checking to see if you survived," he said with a smile. Violet laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Barely." "Did you know that Ellie Simmons can recite the entire Declaration of Independence from memory, but can't add 2 plus 2? "That sounds like Ellie," he agreed, stepping inside. "Her father reads political speeches to her as bedtime stories. And the Wilson twins are terrors but brilliant with anything mechanical," he finished. "They once took apart Dr. Peterson's clock and put it back together, working better than before." "You know them all well," Violet observed. Xavier shrugged. "It's a small town. Everyone's business becomes everyone else's eventually." He paused, seemed to consider his next words carefully. "I was wondering if you might like to see a bit more of the area this weekend. The weather's been fine, and there's a spot by the river that's worth the ride." Violet felt a flutter of something warm in her chest. "That sounds lovely, but I'm not much of a rider." "Old Bessie at the livery is gentle as a lamb," he assured her. "We could go Saturday morning if you're agreeable." She found herself nodding. "I'd like that." The week passed in a blur of lessons, corrections, and small triumphs. Violet settled into a routine, rising early to prepare her lessons, teaching until mid-afternoon, then spending her evenings grading and planning for the next day. She took dinner with Mrs. Landry, who proved to be an invaluable source of information about her pupils' families and circumstances. When Saturday arrived, Violet dressed in a simple skirt and blouse suitable for riding. Xavier met her at the livery stable, where he'd already saddled 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a placid gray mare that regarded Violet with indifferent eyes. "This is Bessie," he introduced them. "She knows the way better than I do." True to Xavier's word, the mare was a gentle mount, and Violet soon found herself relaxing into the rhythm of their ride. They followed a trail that wound away from town, through groves of cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering silver in the morning sunlight. Xavier proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. He told her how Palisade had begun as a trading post established by a French-Canadian trapper named Deschamps, who had married a Blackfoot woman and built the first permanent structure where the general store now stood. "What brought you to Palisade?" Violet asked as they rode side by side along a stretch of open meadow dotted with wildflowers. Xavier was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The war," he said finally. "After Appomattox, I couldn't go back to Tennessee, too many ghosts." He glanced at her. "I was 17 when I enlisted, 21 when it ended. Felt like I'd lived 3 lifetimes by then." Violet calculated quickly. That would make him 32 now, only 8 years her senior. "You fought for the Union, against my family's wishes," he confirmed. "My father owned a small plantation, not many slaves, but enough that he sided with the Confederacy. He disowned me the day I left." His voice carried no bitterness, only a resigned acceptance. "I headed west after the war, worked as a ranch hand, a scout for the Army, even tried my hand at prospecting. Ended up in Palisade 5 years ago when the previous sheriff was killed in a robbery. The town council was desperate and I was available. And good with a gun, I imagine," Violet added softly. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Too good, some might say, not a skill I'm proud of, but it served its purpose." He changed the subject. "What about you? What brings a Boston-educated lady to the wilds of Montana Territory?" Violet hesitated. "I suppose I was running too, in a way. My father died last year. He was a professor at Harvard History and Literature. My mother passed when I was 12. There was pressure to marry a colleague of his. A man 30 years my senior who saw me as a convenient housekeeper with the proper educational background to assist with his research." Xavier's expression darkened. "I take it you didn't share his view of a suitable arrangement." "No," Violet laughed without humor. "Professor Whitmore was most put out when I declined his proposal. He'd already informed the faculty wives that we were to be married in June. Bold of him. Presumptuous," she corrected. When the advertisement for teaching positions in Montana Territory appeared in the Boston Educational Gazette, it seemed like Providence. They crested a small hill, and the landscape opened before them. Below, a river wound its way through a valley, its waters reflecting the blue of the sky. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow even in June. "It's beautiful," Violet breathed. Xavier dismounted and helped her down from Bessie. "This is what I wanted to show you, best view in the county." They spread a blanket on the grass, and Xavier produced a simple picnic from his saddlebags: bread, cheese, dried apples, and a jar of honey. They ate in companionable silence, watching the play of light across the valley as clouds drifted overhead. "Do you ever regret coming west?" Violet asked eventually. Xavier considered the question. "No, for all its hardships, there's a freedom here you can't find back east. A man or woman can reinvent themselves, become who they were meant to be rather than who others expect." "Is that what you've done? Become who you were meant to be?" He turned to look at her, his blue eyes searching her face. "I'm still figuring that out." The air between them seemed to thicken. Violet was acutely aware of his proximity, the way his hand rested just inches from hers on the blanket. For a moment she thought he might close that distance, but instead he rose to his feet and offered her his hand. "There's something else I want to show you before we head back." He led her down a narrow path to the riverbank, where the water pooled in a small, tranquil cove. Wildflowers grew right to the water's edge, creating splashes of yellow, purple, and white against the green. "Local legend says this pool has special properties," Xavier explained. "The Blackfoot believe it's a meeting place between worlds where prayers are more likely to be heard." "Do you believe that?" Violet asked, kneeling to touch the clear water. "I've seen stranger things prove true," he replied. "My deputy, Jim Running Elk, says his grandmother came here when she couldn't bear children. 9 months later, his father was born." Violet dipped her fingers into the cool water. "What would you pray for if prayers are truly heard here?" Xavier didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "Peace, I suppose, for the memories to quiet down sometimes." She looked up at him, seeing the shadows that lingered behind his eyes. On impulse, she reached for his hand and pressed her damp fingers against his palm. "Then I hope your prayer is granted, Sheriff Harrington." The summer months passed in a pleasant rhythm. Violet's students made progress, some by leaps and bounds, others in small, hard-won increments. The town council, impressed by her dedication, voted to make her position permanent at the end of her trial month. Xavier became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse. sometimes bringing interesting specimens for her science lessons, unusual rocks, a bird's nest fallen from a tree, once even a harmless bull snake in a glass jar that had the children alternately terrified and fascinated. They developed a habit of Sunday afternoon rides, exploring the countryside around Palisade. Sometimes they would take a picnic, other times simply ride and talk. Violet learned about Xavier's time in the war, the battles he'd fought, the friends he'd lost. He in turn heard about her childhood in Boston, her father's scholarly pursuits, her mother's love of music and art. As August ripened into September, Violet realized with a start that she had been in Palisade for nearly 3 months. The town no longer felt foreign to her. She knew the rhythms of its days, the faces of its people, the peculiarities of its weather. She had created a small but comfortable home in her rooms at Mrs. Landry's, decorating with wildflowers, interesting stones collected on her rides with Xavier, and drawings gifted to her by her students. One crisp September evening, as she sat grading arithmetic papers on her small desk, a knock at her door revealed Mrs. Landry with a sealed envelope. "Special delivery from the sheriff," the landlady said with a knowing smile. "That man rides past this house at least 3 times a day when he's on his rounds." Violet accepted the envelope, ignoring the implication in Mrs. Landry's tone. Once alone, she broke the seal and unfolded the note. "Harvest Festival this Saturday," Xavier had written in his precise hand. "Would be honored if you would accompany me. Town tradition includes dinner and dancing under the stars." Her heart fluttered as she penned her acceptance. She had attended several town functions since her arrival, but always as the schoolteacher, never explicitly as Xavier's companion. The Harvest Festival was Palisade's largest celebration of the year. Farmers and ranchers from miles around came to town, bringing their best produce and livestock for judging. There were contests for everything from the largest pumpkin to the finest embroidery, races for children and adults, and in the evening, a grand feast followed by dancing in the town square. Violet wore her best dress, a deep green that Mrs. Landry had helped her remake from one found in a trunk of unclaimed items at the general store. Her hair was arranged in loose curls, secured with tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. Xavier called for her promptly at 5, wearing a clean white shirt and black suit that made him look more like a banker than a sheriff, except for the ever-present gun at his hip. "You look beautiful, Miss Turner," he said softly as she opened the door. "I believe, as my escort, you might call me Violet tonight," she replied with a smile. The festival was everything she could have imagined and more. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, casting a golden glow over the town square. Tables groaned under the weight of food: roast beef, ham, venison, chicken, and sides of every description. Children ran laughing between adults, their faces sticky with candy and excitement. Xavier kept her at his side throughout the evening, introducing her to ranchers and their families who lived too far from town to send their children to her school. They ate at a long table with Dr. Peterson and his wife, Mayor Stanton and his daughter, and Jim Running Elk, Xavier's deputy, a quiet man in his 40s whose dark eyes missed nothing. When the tables were cleared and the band struck up a lively tune, Xavier led her to the cleared space that served as a dance floor. They moved together through waltzes and reels, his hand warm at her waist, his steps sure and steady. As the night deepened and the music slowed, he drew her closer than propriety strictly allowed. "I have something to show you," he murmured close to her ear. "Can you slip away for a moment?" Curious, Violet followed him away from the lights and music, down a side street to where the sheriff's office stood dark and quiet. Xavier unlocked the door and lit a lamp, then led her to his desk. "I received this by telegram yesterday," he explained, handing her a folded piece of paper. "Wasn't sure if I should give it to you." Violet opened the message, her eyes widening as she read, "To Sheriff X. Harrington, Palisade, Montana Territory, seeking information on whereabouts of Miss Violet Turner. Stop position at Fort Benton still open. Stop replacement teacher returned east. Due to illness. Stop please advise. If Miss Turner wishes to fulfill original contract. Stop regards J. Morrison, Fort Benton School Board." She looked up at Xavier, whose face had settled into a carefully neutral expression. "They still want me in Fort Benton." "You signed no contract here," he said quietly. You're free to go if that's what you want. Fort Benton is bigger, more established. The salary would be better. Violet carefully refolded the telegram, aware that her hands were trembling slightly. And what do you want, Sheriff Harrington? His composure cracked then, a flash of raw emotion crossing his features before he controlled it. What I want doesn't matter. You came west for a purpose, and it wasn't to be stranded in Palisade. Plans change, she said softly. People change. Xavier took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Violet, a commotion outside interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass carried from the direction of the town square. Xavier's expression shifted instantly from vulnerable to alert. Stay here, he ordered, checking his gun before striding to the door. Violet, of course, did no such thing. She followed him at a discreet distance as he hurried back toward the festival. The scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. A group of cowboys, strangers, not local men, had apparently ridden into town and decided to join the celebration. Now they were causing trouble, harassing the local women and picking fights with the men. That's far enough, gentlemen, Xavier's voice cut through the noise, pitched to Carrie. I think it's time you moved on. The tallest of the cowboys, a man with a scarred face and mean eyes, turned to face him. Well, if it ain't the law, we're just having some fun, ain't we, boys? His companions, 5 in all, muttered agreement, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Violet noticed with alarm that they had positioned themselves to flank Xavier, who stood alone, his posture deceptively relaxed. Your fun is disturbing the peace, Xavier replied evenly. Mount up and ride out, and there won't be any trouble. The leader laughed, an ugly sound. Seems to me you're outnumbered, Sheriff. Maybe we'll just take what we want and leave when we're good and ready. His hand moved toward his holster, but before he could draw, Xavier's gun was already out, aimed steadily at the man's chest. You're not faster than a bullet, McCrae, Xavier said, and Violet realized with a start that he knew this man. Neither are your friends. Walk away while you still can. A tense silence fell over the square. The townspeople had backed away, mothers clutching children, men standing protectively in front of their families. Violet held her breath, aware that she was witnessing something that could end in bloodshed. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Deputy Running Elk emerged from the shadows, a shotgun in his hands. You heard the sheriff, he said calmly. Time to go. McCrae's eyes darted between Xavier and Jim, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted. With a curse, he dropped his hand away from his gun. Another time, Harrington. We got history that needs settling. Not today, Xavier replied, his aim never wavering. And not in my town. The cowboys mounted their horses and rode out, McCrae's parting glare promising future trouble. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded did Xavier holster his weapon. The festival mood was broken. Families gathered their belongings and began heading home, casting nervous glances toward the road where the cowboys had disappeared. Xavier spoke briefly with Mayor Stanton and Jim Running Elk, then made his way to where Violet stood. I'm sorry about that, he said, his voice tight. Those men, I've had dealings with them before, bad business. Who were they? Violet asked, walking beside him as he escorted her back toward Mrs. Landry's boarding house. Xavier's jaw clenched. Cattle rustlers, among other things. McCrae spent 3 years in territorial prison on evidence I provided. Seems he's out now and hasn't forgotten. They reached the boarding house in silence. On the porch, Xavier paused, looking down at Violet with troubled eyes. About the telegram, he began. I'll send my regrets to Fort Benton tomorrow, she interrupted. My place is here now. Relief washed across his features, followed quickly by concern. After what you just saw, are you certain Palisade isn't always as peaceful as it might seem? Violet smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek briefly. Neither am I, Sheriff Harrington. He caught her hand before she could withdraw it, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spreading up her arm and across her chest. Good night, Miss Turner. Good night, Xavier. The next morning, Xavier rode out with Jim Running Elk to ensure that McCrae and his men had truly left the area. They found tracks leading north, toward the Canadian border, which provided some reassurance. They'll be back, Jim said matter-of-factly as they turned their horses toward Palisade. McCrae doesn't forget a grudge. I know, Xavier agreed grimly. We'll be ready when they come. Life in Palisade returned to its normal rhythm. Violet sent her response to Fort Benton, declining the position with sincere thanks, and threw herself into preparing for the autumn term. Xavier resumed his duties, though Violet noticed he spent more time on patrol around the town's perimeter and often conferred with his deputy in low, serious tones. Their Sunday rides continued, though now Xavier insisted on staying closer to town. He taught Violet to shoot a small pistol despite her initial reluctance. "I pray you'll never need to use it," he told her as he adjusted her grip on the weapon, "but I'll sleep better knowing you can protect yourself if necessary." October brought cooler weather and the first hints of gold in the cottonwood leaves. Violet organized a harvest celebration for her students, complete with apple bobbing and a spelling competition that the entire town turned out to witness. As she watched Peter Wilson correctly spell extraordinary to win the contest, Violet caught Xavier's eye across the schoolroom. He gave her a small nod, his pride in her accomplishments evident in his smile. In that moment, she realized with sudden clarity that she had fallen in love with him, with his quiet strength, his hidden tenderness, his unwavering dedication to the town and people under his protection. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it brought a sense of peace. Whatever the future held, her heart had found its home. November arrived with the first dusting of snow and a letter from Boston that shattered Violet's newfound tranquility. It was from her father's attorney, informing her that Professor Whitmore was contesting her inheritance on the grounds that her father had verbally promised her hand in marriage along with a substantial dowry. The case was weak, the attorney assured her, but she would need to return to Boston to testify. Xavier found her on the schoolhouse steps after classes, the letter clutched in her hand, her face pale with distress. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert to her distress. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. His expression darkened as he read. "This man is persisting in his claims even after you've made your wishes clear." "Apparently so," Violet sighed. "According to Mr. Barnes, Professor Whitmore is claiming that my father and he had an understanding and that I left Boston to avoid fulfilling my family's obligation." "That's absurd," Xavier growled. "No court would force a woman to marry against her will." "They won't," she agreed. "But they could rule that part of my inheritance was intended as a dowry and award it to Whitmore as compensation for the broken engagement. It's not a fortune, but it's all I have from my parents." Xavier handed the letter back, his face grim. "When will you leave?" "The attorney suggests I depart as soon as possible. The case is scheduled to be heard in early December." Violet looked up at him, her heart constricting. "I don't want to go, Xavier." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Then don't. Let me send a telegram to this Barnes fellow. I can explain that you're established here, that travel in winter is dangerous. And let Whitmore steal what's rightfully mine." Violet shook her head. "I can't, not without a fight." Xavier's eyes softened with understanding. "Then I'll go with you." "You can't leave Palisade," she protested. "Especially not with McCrae still out there somewhere. The town needs you." "Jim can handle things for a few weeks," Xavier insisted. "I won't let you face this alone." Their argument continued over dinner at the hotel restaurant where they had taken to sharing a meal once a week. In the end, they reached a compromise. Xavier would escort Violet as far as Omaha, where she could catch the eastbound train in relative safety. He would then return to Palisade while she continued to Boston. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of preparations. Violet arranged for Mrs. Peterson, the doctor's wife who had taught school before her marriage, to take over her classes temporarily. Xavier briefed Jim running elk extensively on everything from routine patrols to the most troublesome residents of the town. They would travel by stagecoach to Helena, then take the newly completed railroad east. The evening before their departure, Xavier came to the boarding house to confirm their early morning start. Mrs. Landry tactfully withdrew to the kitchen, leaving them alone in the small parlor. "Are you certain about this journey?" Xavier asked, standing by the fireplace, his tall frame silhouetted against the flames. "Winter travel can be treacherous." "I have no choice," Violet replied from her seat on the settee, "but I admit I'm grateful for your company, at least for part of the way." Xavier nodded, his eyes troubled. "There's something I need to tell you before we leave, something about my past that you should know." The serious tone in his voice made Violet sit up straighter. "What is it?" McCrae and his men, Xavier began, then paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Our history isn't just about me arresting him for cattle rustling. Before I came to Palisade, I rode with a group of men who hunted down outlaws for bounty. McCrae's brother was one of them. Violet's eyes widened. You were a bounty hunter. For 3 years after the war, he confirmed. It was a dark time in my life. I was angry, rootless. The work suited me then because it required few moral considerations, just track down men with prices on their heads and bring them in. What happened to McCrae's brother? Violet asked, though she suspected she already knew. Xavier's jaw tightened. He didn't want to be taken alive, drew on me, I was faster. He met her eyes directly. I've killed men, Violet, not just in war, not all of them deserved it. She absorbed this information, watching the play of emotions across his face: regret, defiance, and beneath it all, fear. Fear that this revelation would change how she saw him. The man you were then, she said carefully, is not the man standing before me now, isn't he? Xavier challenged softly. McCrae would say otherwise. McCrae doesn't know you as I do. Violet rose from her seat and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. The Xavier Harrington I know protects those who need protection. He treats everyone fairly. He reads poetry when he thinks no one is watching. A flicker of surprise crossed his features at that last observation. Violet smiled. Mrs. Landry's son-in-law delivered a package of books last month. I saw the volume of Tennyson on your desk. A reluctant smile tugged at Xavier's mouth. A man has to improve his mind somehow. A bounty hunter who reads Tennyson is a complex man indeed, Violet replied, still holding his hands. But it's the man you are today who matters to me, not who you were yesterday. Xavier looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. The firelight played across his features, softening the hard lines earned from years in the sun and wind. Violet, when you return from Boston? Yes, she prompted when he hesitated. Will you consider staying in Palisade permanently? Not just as our teacher, but as he stopped, seeming unable to find the right words. As what, Xavier? Violet's heart beat faster, hope rising in her chest. Before he could answer, the front door burst open. Jim Running Elk stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his breath coming in quick bursts. Trouble, he said simply. McCrae's back with more men. They've taken over the saloon. Xavier's demeanor changed instantly, the tender moment shattered. How many? 10, maybe 12, Jim replied. They're demanding you come face them, alone. Violet clutched Xavier's arm. You can't go, it's a trap. I know, he said grimly. But if I don't, they'll tear the town apart looking for me. He turned to Jim. Get the mayor and Dr. Peterson. Have them evacuate as many people as they can to the church. It's the sturdiest building in town. Jim nodded and disappeared into the night. Xavier looked down at Violet, his expression torn. I have to go. Then I'm coming with you, she declared, already reaching for her shawl. Absolutely not, Xavier's voice was sharp. You'll go to the church with the others. And wait helplessly while you walk into an ambush, Violet challenged. I think not. Their argument was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass and distant shouting. Xavier swore under his breath. We don't have time for this. Stay with Mrs. Landry, please, Violet. The plea in his eyes was her undoing. Be careful, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. I need you to come back to me. Xavier caught her hand and pressed a swift, hard kiss to her palm. I will. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a chill through Violet's heart. Mrs. Landry emerged from the kitchen, her face pale but composed. Come, dear, we should join the others at the church. No, Violet said, her mind racing. You go ahead. There's something I need to do first. Before the older woman could protest, Violet hurried to her room. From the bottom drawer of her bureau, she retrieved the small pistol Xavier had given her. It felt heavy and foreign in her hand, but she checked the chambers as he had taught her. Confirming it was loaded through her window, she could see people hurrying through the snow toward the church, some carrying children, others helping the elderly. In the direction of the saloon, lanterns blazed, casting long shadows across the white, dusted street. Violet slipped the pistol into her pocket and made her way downstairs and out the back door. The cold air bit at her exposed skin, but she hardly noticed as she moved quietly through the darkness, keeping to the shadows between buildings. The saloon stood at the far end of the main street, its windows glowing yellow in the night. Violet approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear voices now loud, angry, fueled by alcohol and old grudges. "Harrington, show yourself, you coward." That would be McCrae, his voice carrying into the night. "We got unfinished business." Violet crept around to the side of the building, where a small window provided a view into the saloon. What she saw made her blood run cold. Xavier stood in the center of the room, hands raised slightly to show he was not reaching for his weapon. Around him, a circle of rough-looking men, all armed, watched with predatory anticipation. McCrae faced him, a pistol aimed directly at Xavier's chest. "You took my brother from me," McCrae was saying, his words slightly slurred. "Now I'm going to take everything from you. Starting with this town you're so proud of protecting." "Your brother made his choice," Xavier replied evenly. "Just like you're making yours now, kill me and you'll hang for it. Is that what you want?" McCrae laughed. "Who says we're staying around to be caught? Once we're done here, we're heading north, but first I want to see you beg." "That won't happen," Xavier said, his voice calm despite the danger. "Let's end this between us, McCrae. These people have done nothing to you." "They harbored you," McCrae snarled. "That's enough." Violet's mind raced. She had to do something, but what? One small pistol against a room full of armed men would be suicide. She needed help. Moving as quickly and quietly as she could, she made her way toward the church. As she'd hoped, she found Jim Running Elk standing guard outside, rifle in hand. "Jim," she whispered urgently. "Xavier is in the saloon with McCrae and his men. They're going to kill him." The deputy's expression remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. "How many?" "At least 10, Violet replied. "They have him surrounded." Jim nodded once. "Get inside with the others." "No," Violet insisted. "I want to help." Jim studied her face for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Can you create a distraction, something to draw their attention away from the front of the building?" "Yes," Violet said without hesitation. "What are you planning?" "To even the odds," Jim replied simply. He whistled softly, and from the shadows emerged 3 men Violet recognized as local ranchers. Each carried a rifle or shotgun. "We'll come in the front when we hear your signal. Make it loud." Violet hurried back toward the saloon, her mind working furiously. A distraction that would draw attention to the rear of the building, something loud enough to be heard inside. Her gaze fell on the livery stable across from the saloon. Of course, gathering her courage, Violet ran to the stable. Inside, horses shifted nervously in their stalls, sensing the tension in the air. She located a lantern and lit it, then moved to the back wall where saddles and tack hung. Taking a deep breath, she removed the small pistol from her pocket. "I hope this works," she murmured, then aimed at a point high on the wooden wall and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the confined space. The horses neighed in panic, kicking at their stalls. Violet fired again, then dropped the gun and began ringing the large bell used to signal fires. The effect was immediate. From the saloon, she heard shouts of confusion. Through the window, she could see several of McCrae's men moving toward the back door, drawn by the commotion. That was when Jim and his men burst through the front entrance, weapons raised. "Drop your guns." Jim's voice rang out. Now, chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded within the saloon, the sound reverberating through the night air. Violet pressed herself against the stable wall, heart pounding, praying that Xavier was safe. The gunfight lasted less than a minute, though it seemed an eternity. Then silence fell, broken only by the continued agitated movements of the horses. Violet couldn't bear the uncertainty. She slipped out of the stable and approached the saloon cautiously. The door hung open, spilling light onto the snow-covered ground. Inside, she could see figures moving, but couldn't distinguish friend from foe. "Xavier," she called, her voice trembling. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, but otherwise unharmed. "Violet, I told you to stay with Mrs. Landry." Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her knees weak. She rushed forward, not caring who saw as she threw her arms around him. "You're alive." Xavier's arms closed around her, holding her tightly against his chest. "Thanks to you and Jim," he murmured against her hair. "That was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever witnessed." "Is it over?" she asked, pulling back to look at his face. "McCrae, dead," Xavier confirmed grimly. "He drew on Jim when we had him cornered. 4 of his men are wounded, the rest have surrendered, Doctor." Peterson arrived then with his medical bag. followed by several townsmen with rope to secure the prisoners. Xavier reluctantly released Violet, though he kept her close at his side as he directed the aftermath of the confrontation. By dawn, the wounded had been treated, the dead removed to the undertakers, and the surviving outlaws locked securely in the jail cells. The town gathered in the church, where Mayor Stanton announced that the danger had passed, thanks to the bravery of Sheriff Harrington, Deputy Running Elk, and to Violet's embarrassment, our own schoolteacher, Miss Turner, whose quick thinking saved many lives. As the townspeople dispersed to their homes, Xavier finally had a moment alone with Violet. They stood on the church steps, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered street in shades of pink and gold. "Our trip to Omaha will have to be delayed," Xavier said, gently touching the bandaged doctor. Peterson had applied to his forehead. "I can't leave until the prisoners are transferred to Helena." "I understand," Violet replied. "The hearing isn't for 3 weeks yet. There's still time." Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious. "Last night, before Jim interrupted us, I was trying to ask you something important." Violet's heart quickened. "Yes, you were. The thing is," Xavier continued, suddenly seeming uncharacteristically unsure of himself, "I'm not a man of great means. Being sheriff of a small town doesn't bring wealth or prestige, but I can offer you a home, protection, and my complete devotion for as long as I live." "Xavier," Violet began, but he held up a hand. "Please let me finish before I lose my nerve." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Violet Turner. I think I've loved you since that first night, when you stood in my office dripping rainwater on my floor and still managed to look like the most dignified woman I'd ever met." Violet felt tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to miss a moment of his face as he spoke. "I know it's sudden," he continued. "We've known each other only a few months, but out here life doesn't always give you the luxury of time." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, simple ring, a gold band set with a single pearl. "This belonged to my mother. I'd be honored if you would wear it, as my wife." Violet looked at the ring, then back to Xavier's face, so dear to her now, so essential to her happiness. "Your proposal is sudden," she said softly. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "So was the storm that brought you to me." In that moment, Violet knew with absolute certainty that her future lay not in Boston with its familiar streets and cultured society, but here in this wild, beautiful land, with this man who had risked everything to protect what he loved. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Harrington." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened into something that spoke of promises and shared tomorrows. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "When we return from Boston," Xavier said, his forehead resting against hers, "we'll be married, right here in this church. With all of Palisade in attendance, no doubt," Violet laughed. "Mrs. Landry will be unbearable with satisfaction. She's been predicting this since my second week in town." "Smart woman," Xavier grinned. "Though not as smart as the one who thought to stampede horses as a distraction." Violet shook her head. "I didn't actually stampede them, just made enough noise to draw attention. The shooting was improvised." "Remind me never to underestimate you," Xavier said, his expression turning serious again. "You saved my life last night, Violet." "As you saved mine when I arrived," she replied. "I think that makes us even." They walked hand in hand through the awakening town, their future stretching before them like the vast Montana sky wide open, full of promise, and theirs to shape together. The journey to Boston and back took nearly 6 weeks, delayed by winter storms and railway complications. But it was triumphant in every respect. With Xavier at her side, Violet successfully defended her inheritance against Professor Whitmore's claims. The judge, impressed by the testimony of a Montana Territory sheriff who had traveled 2,000 miles to support his future wife's rightful claim, ruled entirely in Violet's favor. They were married in Palisade's small church on a bright April morning in 1877, with wildflowers decorating the altar and every resident of the town in attendance. Violet wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Landry had helped her select in Boston, and Xavier looked resplendent in a new black suit. As they spoke their vows, Violet glanced out the church window at the Montana sky, impossibly blue and vast with possibility. The storm that had brought her to Palisade had changed the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. But as Xavier's steady hands placed a gold band on her finger, she knew with complete certainty that she had found her true home. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Xavier would always begin the story the same way. It was the strangest storm I'd ever seen, coming out of nowhere on a clear summer day. And Violet would smile, remembering how that unexpected tempest had delivered her not into disaster, but directly into the arms of her destiny.